Good evening, Aidan. Welcome to Savers Podcast, the sustainability conversation. It's a pleasure having you with us today as the podcast guest for our fourth podcast episode. We have seen your remarkable work as the Impacts and Assurance Manager at the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber. And before we officially begin the podcast, let me start by introducing the two podcast hosts. I'm Simran, and I handle marketing and communication at Savers.
I'm Tanya, and I handle business development and operations at Savor. So let's first give you a brief introduction about Savor. So Savor is a tech startup started in August 2019 that reduces food wastage and tackles food insecurity while empowering organizations with savings through digitalization via our one-stop B2B e-procurement and sponsorship web app platform.
We connect B2B customers like nonprofits, companies, and school clubs who are interested to procure for their operations, programs, and events from merchants who offer expiring, blemished, and surplus, but still perfectly edible food, as well as regular food, corporate gifts, office supply materials, and rental services. So customers can place corporate orders listed at bulk, charity, and corporate discounts and apply for in-kind sponsorships in Singapore.
So today is Savor's third podcast episode, and our theme for this episode is sustainability. This is a 4-part podcast session with one session every week. So we started this podcast series with the aim to get speakers who are experienced and knowledgeable in various particular areas and get them to share about their thoughts, experiences, and advice.
So to add on to Tanya, the key objectives of this podcast are to educate the listeners who are the general public, merchants, and B2B customers who are interested in learning more about the various areas of sustainability in Singapore, from industry experts' knowledge and experience in different sectors, and also to inspire listeners on how they can play a part to support these sustainability areas and the speakers.
So we wanted to learn more about sustainability in the context of climate activism, marine conservation, and climate policy for businesses. So we're all aware that climate change is a cause for concern for everyone around the world. Global climate change has already had observable effects on the environment, and the net damage caused of climate change are likely to be significant and to increase over time. So Aidan, we wanted to direct this question to you. As a strong environmentalist, we wish to learn more about your experiences and perspective as a stakeholder in the current sustainability scene in Singapore.
Thanks very much, Simran and Tanya, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. So maybe I'll start with a brief self-introduction. My name is Aidan. I use he, him pronouns. My journey in the environmental field has happened over, I guess, a couple of years now. It really started, well, for me, it started when I went diving when I was a bit younger than I am today, and really seeing sort of the coral reefs firsthand and really falling in love with the coral reefs, but then also seeing coral bleaching and starting to investigate, the climate crisis and the sort of environmental challenges, that we're going to see in the next couple of years. And the oceans really are a fantastic way to see it. Unfortunately or unfortunately, so you have, coral bleaching, which is one big environmental issue that links to climate crisis. You also have plastic pollution, which is very, very evident in the reefs. You also have overfishing, too much tourism. There's a lot of things basically that you can observe in the marine environment about, the ways in which our living nowadays is less than ideal. And that experience really prompted me to want to study it more and understand it better. And so after diving for a couple of years, I did my undergrad in environmental studies at Yale and US College in Singapore. My specialization was in marine ecology in the face of climate change and anthropogenic influences. And really what it was about was understanding the marine environment better. But as I studied it more and more, I realized also that there is this big 600-pound gorilla in the room, which is the climate crisis that impacts, the oceans, but also impacts so many other aspects of our lives. It impacts things such as our food security, such as where we're going to live, how we're going to live, ambient temperature, wildlife outside of the oceans as well, in the forest. And it really has such wide-ranging and potentially severe impacts that I was interested to study it more. I did a couple of things while I was in university. I co-organized the inaugural Industry Climate Rally, which was held in September 2019. And that was a demonstration where we got folks down to Hong Lim Park basically to rally and show support for stronger governmental action in Singapore on climate policy. I was also the co-founder of Fossil Free Yale and US, which is a divestment movement. And what we were trying to do was to get NUS to stop investing its endowment, which is basically a pool of funds that it has in fossil fuel companies. Because for us, we didn't believe that university education and students' education should be funded, or university should be funded by money that basically will damage the future of our future for youth. So those were some of the things I did while I was in university. I've since stepped back from most of that work now. I also interned for a environmental NGO that's based in the US called Mighty Earth, and for a year I was focused on deforestation issues linked to the palm oil industry, which again is very close to home. So I worked on that for a year, and then as Tanya mentioned at the start of this podcast, I currently work as the Impacts and Assurance Manager at the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber. Basically in my role, I work at the intersection between businesses and NGOs to really chart out what sustainability policy means for the rubber industry. And I think we go beyond just environmental sustainability, but we're also looking at social aspects, we're also looking at economic aspects. How do we protect the most vulnerable groups while ensuring that the industry continues to operate well and I guess provide incomes and livelihoods to everybody across the supply chain? And that's a big question that we're looking to tackle in the work that we do at the platform. So I guess that's sort of a bit of a background from me. I mean, I think, and we can get into this in the questions later. I think that the climate crisis is probably the most devastating thing that we're going to see in our lifetimes. It is definitely going to have an impact on us, and it's a real threat. And that's why myself and many of my friends and people I know in the sector are working on this.
Thank you. That was very insightful, and we really were very intrigued about what you had to say and your background, and gave us a lot of insight about your background and why you got so involved in this current sustainability scene in Singapore.
It really was. It was pretty insightful and quite enthralling. So now we do have a few questions we would like to address to you. So my first one would be, what can we as individuals do to reduce the climate change?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And in the environmental world nowadays, there's actually a big debate, I would say, or a big discussion over whether individual action is more important. That means the action that you and I take as individuals, or systemic action, which people talk about, sort of the policies and the laws and the systems that we live within. And I think as individuals, there's a way to contribute to both sides of this equation. I think on the individual action, there are many articles and resources that have been written about the different ways that we as individuals can have an impact, a positive impact on the climate. There was a particularly controversial one, which I think was published, 2 or 3 years ago, that said, you should just not have kids because kids represent a huge carbon budget, I guess. Very controversial, and we don't have to wade into that today. But there are others as well, right? That, for example, switching your household energy to solar power. So, for example, in Singapore, we have an open market energy grid. So what that means is that you can choose the type of energy you want to buy and who you want to buy it from. There are, I believe, 2 providers who provide sort of 100% solar. One is Sunseap and the other one is Sembcorp. Both of them don't technically give you solar power directly from a solar panel built in Singapore, but they rely on a mechanism called renewable energy credits, which basically means that there is solar energy being produced with your money in another country in which there might be more space to put the panels, and that offset is being used for the energy that we're using here. And that's a really positive impact that people can have. It's really simple. It's just going and checking out your electricity bill and seeing who provides energy and then just changing the energy provider. So that's one. I think another one also that's often talked about is cutting out meat from the diet, or not cutting out, but reducing meat. Cutting out can be really challenging. And for this, the reason for this is that animal products like beef, like pork, to some extent chicken, release a lot of carbon emissions into the environment when they're produced. And so by consuming these also, we expand or we increase the amount of carbon that's required to support us and our livelihoods. But it's a really difficult path to walk. I tried going vegetarian, I don't know, what was it, maybe 5 years ago now, and then I succeeded for a little bit and then I relapsed, and then I tried again, and so it's a real back and forth, and it's difficult for people to really reduce meat intake. It's such a big part of our culture and our traditions and the way that we relate to people. And to some extent, even not being able to go out and eat with people because you don't eat meat is a big challenge. I am mostly vegetarian these days. I'd say like 95, 99%. So it is a challenge, but it's another big thing that we can do. But and then also you also have other things, right? Like reducing your consumption, and reducing your air travel, reducing the amount of times that you take a private transport, like a private car, using public transport instead. But I think, on top of all these things, one common critique that is aimed at individual action is that we are only 1 out of 7 billion people. And so that means that if you stopped doing everything that you did today, you only take out 1 over 7 billion of the carbon emissions that you produce, which is, to some people, quite a small amount. And it is quite a small amount in the grand scheme of things. And so one of the things that another podcast has mentioned in this podcast called How to Save a Planet, they talked about not just doing individual action, but communicating about the individual action and prompting, sharing the positive examples of ways that we're doing good things in our lives with friends. So for example, just saying, hey, I've decided not to fly so much, or I've decided to, eat less meat, and having a conversation about the climate, in that space, and then encouraging people to explore these sorts of positive actions. And it's a bit like a climate MLM. You're trying to sell the idea to somebody and have somebody else sell it down to a few more people, and this domino effect then hopefully helps change the landscape of the ways in which we're living. So that's on the individual action side, and there are lots of resources for this. I've named some of the biggest ones, but you can go down to like the hundreds, or lists that are 100 items long about things that you can do. So there's really a lot on the individual side. I think on the systemic side, then there are ways that individuals can play a role as well in changing systemic action. I think at this point, it's worth reflecting on what is your special skill set and what are the special tools that you have, and how do we use those tools to bring about policy change. So for example, if you're a CEO of a business, if you work in a trade association, if you work in government, right? It's about having these discussions and thinking about how in your field of work you can change the way your business runs, you can change the way the government policies are planned to take into account climate action and carbon emissions. But that's, not everyone is a CEO, not everyone is a political leader. So to some extent, then there are other avenues, including volunteering for causes that work on systemic change. SG Climate Rally is one of them, for example. So we were campaigning for governmental shift, right, and policy shift. And the appeal of systemic action really is that, a smaller group of people can change the entire environment that we live and we work within. If we manage to change the energy grid in Singapore to be 100% solar, that's a lot more effective than trying to talk to everybody in Singapore and saying, hey, you need to change your energy provider, which is a lot more work. And so government policies or company policies are a big lever that we can leverage. But it depends as well, what your special skill set is, and perhaps it's communicating to people, it's working within these movements. There are a lot of roles also within movements that folks can look into, but looking into being part of systemic action is the other thing that I would say. So there's a lot of talking, and I can talk about this for days, but these are some, I guess, topics at the top of my head of what individuals can do.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think it was quite insightful to see how, as individuals, we are able to reduce our impact on the environment and have such measures such as like checking through your energy bill, even like cutting down meat from your diet, or like reducing consumption of private vehicles. I like how you link this to like some of the things that you have done before, such as like SG Climate Rally, which I think is something that's quite important. It's such a powerful youth movement in order to get the government to do something about the Singapore sustainability scene.
Thanks.
So my next question to you would be, what is climate change mitigation to you?
Yeah, so to me, there are two parts to climate change mitigation. I think one is reducing the amount of emissions that we're putting out today, and then the other part is taking the emissions that are already in the air and sort of putting them underground. or putting them somewhere else outside of being in the air. In terms of mitigation, then, as I mentioned, there are a whole lot of different sources, but they basically involve putting less carbon in the air. And this could involve changing the energy that you use, for example, increasing the efficiency of your business processes, reducing wastage, reducing the amount of transport that's required in logistics work. There are lots of different ways that this can be done, either through policy change, through technology change as well, finding more efficient ways, for example, to move a ship through the water could be another way, in which we mitigate it. But the idea basically is to reduce sort of the amount of emissions that we're putting out. The other part of mitigation then is to take the existing carbon that's in the air and moving it into other sources that aren't in the air. Most often, this comes in the form of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is called CCUS for short. And it involves basically filtering carbon out of the air or out of exhaust and exhaust pipes that are putting the carbon in the air, and then using that concentrated amount of carbon for something else. You can use it. I believe people are looking into using it for the production of cement or concrete. You can also use it basically to put it underground and store it away so that it's not in the atmosphere. But the idea is we need to draw down some of the existing carbon that's in the air, because we already have too much as it is out in the atmosphere. So to me, I guess those are the two elements of mitigation.
Okay, thank you. That was pretty interesting, quite insightful, and definitely important points, to be kept in mind. So my next question to you would be, that given that renewable sources provide only a small percentage of our energy and that nuclear power is so expensive, what can we realistically do to get off fossil fuels as soon as possible?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I've done quite, at least for me, I've done a little bit of research to this, and it's a really difficult challenge for Singapore. Just because, even if we covered the whole island in solar panels, we wouldn't get enough energy for our energy needs. And so that's a really big challenge, right? And I think, well, a couple of things. Number one is showing demand for solar energy production. And this is remembering that we are not just a country on our own, but we live within a region, and we live, within a global network of people. And so changing the energy that's sustaining and running our homes, although it doesn't have an impact in Singapore per se, it does increase the solar percentage, or the percentage of solar input in other countries, especially areas in which those RECs are being, say, spent or converted. And so that's one of the things that we can do from an individual perspective. I think other things also involve moving off fossil fuel sources of energy. One big one is the internal combustion engine in cars, and electric cars are becoming increasingly popular. And it has been found that shifting from a conventional car, or an ICE car as they are called, to an electric car does have carbon emission savings throughout the entire life cycle of the vehicle, even if the car is being powered by natural gas. Because what happens is that the electricity is coming from a natural gas power plant, I don't know, somewhere into us, but that process of creating energy is more efficient than the one that's inside your car, because they can do it at scale. And so you do have emission savings even from switching the type of vehicle that you're using. I think in the longer term, and I'm thinking more broadly then, is that we do need to incentivize investment into solar energy, into battery technology, into different kinds of technologies that will enable us to shift off fossil fuels. I think nuclear is expensive depending on where you are in the world. I think right now nuclear as it stands isn't really feasible for Singapore given the risk, but they are exploring micro nuclear, which is sort of a compacted version of a nuclear power plant, which is interesting. And there are also next generation nuclear reactors using things like thorium as a catalyst. So those are interesting options, but really at this point it's about investment, and it's about shifting consumer demand and showing demand for alternative energy. Those are the two big things that I would think of.
Okay.
Thank you, Aidan. I think we really learned a lot about how Singapore's current shift to electric cars, and also trying to incentivize investments into more sustainable forms of energy, such as solar energy, would hopefully help to reduce the use of consumption of fossil fuels. And I think with that, I would like to thank you about sharing for your experience. And I think it was a very good experience having you here talking about climate change. And we really learned a lot, and we sure our audience will learn a lot as well.
Yes,
Cool.
thank you. It was a very enthralling session where we indeed learned a lot about your experience working at Mighty Earth and your answers to our questions too. So this brings us to the end of our third podcast episode. So stay tuned for our other podcast guests who will be appearing in our subsequent podcast episodes.
So if you like what you're listening to, do follow us on our podcast platforms to be updated when our podcast episodes are released every Wednesday at 5 p.m. The Sustainability Conversation podcast is on Savor's Spotify podcast, iTunes podcast, YouTube, IGTV, and Facebook videos. How you can find Savor on these platforms is by searching Savor and or the podcast name, The Sustainability Conversation. So do follow Savor's account on the platforms that our podcast is on to be the first to be notified when the latest episode is out. Do share this podcast with your network if you think that they'll find this beneficial. Thank you.